You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the 95 Podcast. This is Dale Sellers, Executive Director at 95 Network. And today, I have a friend who had to get up really early to be with me because he's on Mountain Time and I'm on Eastern Time. Joe Epley's with me. And Joe, how are you doing today?
I'm good, man. I appreciated your assurance earlier that the sun will indeed rise over here. And so we're getting closer to that. But otherwise, things are good, man, over here in Montana. So.
Yeah, I just wanted, I wanted to let you know, hey, the sun is coming up. It's going to be there in a little while. My middle daughter and son-in-law, they actually live in Montana, and I think they're not too far from you. Which part of Montana are you in? They're in Bozeman.
Right. So I'm in southeastern Montana, which is pretty close to North Dakota. And being that it's such a wide state, they're about 5.5 hours, maybe, 300 something miles from me, but that still feels close because this is Montana. So, 5.5 hours ain't bad,
I know exactly what you're talking about. Growing up in the South, I'd heard things like big sky country, but until you come out there and see it, it's really hard to explain what it's like. Yeah. It's one of the most beautiful states I've ever seen. And it just goes on and on and on. And then you have areas where it's flat, a little flatter, and then boom, there's the mountains. And so it's really cool. Well, I'm excited to have you on today. You and I were recently on a on a webinar together, and we were talking about rural pastors and rural ministry, and specifically about bivocational ministry. And I really appreciated some of the things you had to say. And I want to get to know you a little bit because I want to talk today specifically about bivocational ministry and rural ministry, and get your take on some things. But before we do that, just kind of take a few moments to tell us your story a little bit. Let us get to know Joe a little bit.
Yeah, so I am, I've been in ministry full-time for about 10 years, primarily as a youth pastor. Interestingly enough, specifically pertaining to today's conversation, I wasn't exactly born, rural in a sense. That was not my mindset growing up. I came from Billings, which is still not, urban by a lot of settings, but for Montana, it's our largest city, about 150,000 in the area. And that's where I grew up. That's where I was born, raised, got saved, started work at my first church. And from there, I moved out to Baker, Montana, which is in farther southeast in the corner next to North Dakota. And it's a town of 1,200. And so it was definitely a shift for me. And I moved when I was 21. So I was still pretty young. And so definitely had days where, I missed amenities and definitely kind of struggled for a number of years to kind of grow to love the small town. And really, not only was it the people of my own context, but I definitely felt the challenges, right? Not only, again, the lack of amenities, but rural is kind of an outsider's mentality where there's a lot of caution given, and trust takes a lot of time, and it's a lot, we know that it's a trying context, but, over time, I determined to make friends in ministry. And so I would set out, to find colleagues, and there's about, 16 to 20 towns that dot eastern Montana that are all rural. And so I started driving around and sitting down with pastors and sitting down and hearing about their struggles in their churches. And so I really went from, having a love-hate relationship with the rural to loving it for myself to now wanting to champion it to others. And so it was really quite a journey. I would say I'm still on the journey, but it's taken me about all 10 years that I've been in the rural context. And it's definitely been a fun one. And so to that end, not only do we have a church, of about 100 people, and I serve as the associate pastor. I was formerly the youth pastor, and run all sorts of community outreach stuff and try and do good in our small town while we're doing ministry. But a couple of years ago, I was doing my master's degree, and I was doing it through one of the Assemblies of God Bible colleges, Trinity Bible College, which itself is in Ellendale, North Dakota, about a town of 1,200 people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a gentleman there by the name of Dwight Sandos who used to serve in Nebraska with the Assemblies of God. And he now runs a whole degree program that is on rural ministry. He has a master's degree available that studies and specifically contextualizes rural pastoring. And he approached me one day and said, "Hey, I know you've been around, and I've observed the work you're doing and all these things," and said, "I'd love to have you jump on with this organization that I'm starting called Rural Advancement." And Rural Advancement is an organization that now I've worked with for the last couple of years, and I've served on a volunteer basis. But a lot of it and a lot of the heart behind it was resourcing people with things that make sense, right? All of us could point to, especially again, if you truly define yourself as a rural pastor, you could find a lot of resources written by people from bigger places. All of us can fondly look back on the conference where someone says, I grew my church from 25 to 5,000, and here's all those principles. And you sit there scratching your head and saying, well, my whole county has 2,500. So I'm not against believing that the Lord will bless things,
Sure.
but it starts to maybe see that disconnect. And so I know that for Dwight, kind of the director of Rural Advancement, his heart was, can we make resources that are not only spoken to the rural context, but are spoken by actual real-time practitioners?
Mm-hmm.
And so my first several contributions were through a lot of interviews and blog postings. And then he told me that he had this podcast that had sort of gotten off the ground, but really fallen by the wayside. And I said, man, that sounds like something we should be doing all the time. And so I took over the Rural Advancement podcast at the end of August. I've done about 20 interviews and have no plans on stopping.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal really is to just highlight rural voices. So we're chatting again with pastors, who have great wisdom and great things to say. We've interviewed pastors who came from rural and pastor in larger places. We've interviewed pastors who are pastoring in towns of 98, and hearing, the valuable wisdom they bring to the table and the valuable wisdom they bring to the mosaic of the kingdom of God. And so that's a little bit about me. Practically speaking, I have a wife and two daughters. My oldest is 4, my youngest is 18, maybe 20 months. I can't remember. I married my boss's daughter, so my lead pastor didn't realize that maybe that was part of the deal when I moved here. But we've been making it work, and we've been married about 8 years, and so it's been a lot of fun. But that's again a little bit about me and my ministry. So.
Now that we're at this point in this side of the pandemic, I'm one who doesn't say that we're post-pandemic, because I think there's ongoing implications. What's the in your mind? What are you seeing the impact of the pandemic has been on specifically rural pastors?
It's one of those things that maybe is not necessarily a different impact than you feel other places, but has maybe different ramifications. Mm-hmm. So obviously a lot of people say, they've affectionately dubbed it the COVID shuffle, where you see a ton, and I have siblings and friends who are in education, and you see it in that realm a lot too, where there's just a ton of pastors, ton of teachers, ton of people who work with people who are now leaving those jobs and those ministries. And so the one tough part is that, let's say there is a church of, 1,000 or 500 even, and a pastor, feels the strain of leading through COVID, leaves that context. I don't have hard numbers on this, but I would argue that church is going to have an easier time drawing in a pastor post-COVID mm-hmm. than a rural church might. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to see that maybe for a church of 100, if that pastor leaves, they might not have enough economically to incentivize a pastor who's been there 10 years and is content with the pay and the situation and has roots in the community. They might not have enough to incentivize another pastor to come back. But on the flip side, and so this is where I'm kind of unsettled, is rural churches, at least in my context, tended to feel the direct effects of COVID less, and not to diminish, obviously, the impact of the pandemic on lives, but a lot of rural places, whether it's a political belief, whether it's mm-hmm. just the lack of population, whether it's, a lot of them didn't even stop meeting in person. And a lot of them didn't see maybe that full political breakdown where everyone was really angry. Now, again, some did, but so you might actually have pastors who weathered just fine and continue right on through in longevity. So it's kind of a 50-50, but those are, I would say, would be the two main branches of how COVID played out in the rural church.
When it comes to pastors in the rural setting, looking for a new church, or the church looking for a new pastor, where do they turn? Because, is it a denominational thing, or is there specific resource or gathering point that they find pastors? What have you seen as you've done your research?
Well, a lot of times, I think it comes down to the strength of your particular tribe of Christianity's ability to network and what they value. Because again, groups and fellowships and denominations such as maybe the SBC or the Assemblies of God or some of these larger denominations, who find themselves, active and whatever, they might have some resources available where they can share, wisdom, and they can say, well, who do we have? But nobody's winning in terms of having enough pastors to fill pulpits.
Yeah, that's kind of the point.
I know that we have a Lutheran church here in our town, as most places do. The Lutherans have done obviously a pretty great job of being spread out, and they have been without a pastor now, I think, for almost 2 years. And when I approached them on it, because I have friends in there, and I just ask questions, you're touching base with ministers and other church people, and I say, hey, what's that looking like? And they said, well, I think that they said across just Montana they had over 100 pulpits unfilled. I didn't even know there was that many Lutheran churches in Montana.
Yeah, well, Montana's
but like
they
right, but they said that, like, minus these incredibly large contexts, the contexts that were either financially stable or had more exposure or influence perceived, they're having trouble filling pulpits. We have a network of evangelical churches, and they have, I think, 30 churches in the state, and I think only like 6 to 10 of them have pastors. And so it's just, so a lot of the conversation I've been hearing is you are kind of dealing with this shortage, and unless your denominational structure is not just, championing it, or not just having it, but really championing rural contexts, it's going to get, I think, harder and harder to recruit. The second thing is, most churches in rural settings, if they have not really spent time developing like leadership pipelines within their own congregation, which again, it's a vicious cycle. Let's say there's a lead pastor who's good at developing leaders, and so maybe he works at that a little bit, but then maybe the time comes, COVID shuffle, whatever happens, he leaves. Well, the next guy might have been half ready, but now he jumps in, and maybe he doesn't last. And also because he's having his own struggles, or well, then maybe they're not, raising up leaders, and then it quickly breaks down, and suddenly you find yourself going, man, there's nobody here, there's nobody in the wings. And if you don't have a huge support system denominationally, it's hard to find people,
Yeah, wouldn't even begin to throw out specifics of numbers, but I think you help bear what I know to be true, and that is there's just there's a great need across the country for pastors to fill pulpits, and they're not pastors in the pipeline, no matter what the group is and no matter what the denomination.
Right.
I assume that's even harder in the rural setting to draw people into specific areas. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah, I would honestly say so. And again, the problem is a lot of people have compared the rural context, and I'm, again, not arguing against larger places at all, but have seen it specifically as a missionary work. It's a missionary context, because a lot of leaders, let's say you do get the traditional track for a pastor, right? Let's say a pastor goes to seminary and they graduate and they're looking for their first pastorate or first youth pastorate or whatever, and they're looking for a position. Well, maybe someone is able to incentivize them, say, hey, come to the rural church. Well, guess what? They're probably moving to a town where they have no connections, and they're going to find a town who for the first 5 years isn't going to trust them fully. And they're losing a ton of amenities, and the pay's not always there. And so you're just asking people to really sacrificially give up a lot. And so the bar of how to make that last long term is just a lot higher. And so I would say, because even again, in my own experience, like, I think a lot of people are coming around denominationally to the idea that we need to be championing rural churches. It's definitely getting, it's getting more and more in the conversation, especially when you look at economic factors. Post-COVID, there is such a thing as the rural remigration, where people are making their way back to places where they feel comfortable raising their kids and all that. And so you're now getting the churches, to our own discredit, kind of reactionally saying, oh, wow, there's actually people coming. We got to deal with this. But even in again, groups that are killing it in terms of trying to make programming and trying to set aside money and trying to incentivize rural, it's like you said, I don't think anyone could truly, like, I have never met a pastoral group who said, yeah, we've got plenty of people in the pipeline. That's just there's never enough people.
That's not out there. And I'm thinking too, it's not as attractional if a pastor's got 5 opportunities to go somewhere.
Sure.
I mean, it's got to be a divine call almost to go to a rural setting, and that's not putting down the rural setting. What I'm trying to say there is that you're probably going to walk into a church that's probably family led, as you have just said, and I didn't even realize it was this long. It takes 5 years to get for them to trust you. And
Yeah,
so,
I had an interesting situation where I had a couple in my town, and so I've been youth pastoring here 9 years, and we work at a youth center. It's a very public setting. It's very community oriented. So like we're trying to do not just religious good, but just good in general.
yes,
just trying to do
to
all
help
those
the
things.
community.
And even then, I had a couple sit down with me for coffee, and they said, and this was year 9, mind you. So I've been here 9 years, and they said, we've been watching you for a couple years, and we think that the work you're doing is good. And then they donated like a sum of money to our youth center, and I'm like, man, I've been here almost a decade, like, and you are just now telling me like, we think you're all right. It just was such a funny moment of like,
it's called
wow,
financial development.
It's just so funny. I'm just like, man, this is so hilarious to me. Like you said, that it just there's a low side where you have to get there, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and you are still seeing layers of the community open up.
Well, I just, it just kind of takes a while sometimes for people to, to buy in and to trust you. And again, in the rural setting, I'm assuming you don't have as many of those families, if you will, to pull from that can do that kind of thing. Did they give you any indication why now was the time? It's okay.
They were writing a check for 10 grand, so I didn't really ask a lot of questions. I was just like, hey, thanks for the donation. I appreciate you. Very thankful. Got it. Just a big thumbs up. It was like, hey, we're good.
Yeah.
But I imagine it's along those lines. I mean, I came in and was excited, and I remember all sorts of stuff. I mean, I think about it, and I'm like, man, if I didn't maybe have good support from my lead pastor, and maybe if I didn't eventually date his daughter, who knows? But I know that
you do have a little bit of job security.
A little bit, but when I moved here, I mean, I even had other pastors who maybe were worried about their own congregations or their own works, and like I didn't exactly experience ministerial camaraderie. I had pastors maybe slandering me a little bit, and I had pastors saying, well, who's this upstart? Who's this young guy?
Sure.
What's he doing in our town? And it just like thinking about it, I'm like, man, if I would have had, I mean, obviously we thank the Lord for where we're at and what we're doing, but like, but it was hard. I can't deny that it was tough to break in, and still tougher to not just break in, but to feel like a true insider, to feel like you're one of the community. It's a huge process. And so I do think, to your point, like, yeah, trying to get pastors there, there's just plenty of hurdles without things already making it harder,
Well, I imagine in your case too, your youth pastor, I would assume that most churches in the rural setting don't have extended staff.
Right.
And so, and see, I wrote a book a couple of years ago, and it's called Stalled: Hope and Help for Pastors Who Thought They'd Be There by Now. And one of the things that I talk about is this unverbalized, but definitely real comparison thing we have. And so sometimes the fact that you are at your church, you're at First Church and I'm over here at Third Church, I don't have a youth pastor, so I feel less than. So, but right. I react more aggressive, if you will, or some way toward you to just kind of try to deflect how I feel about myself. I've seen that a lot. I've seen that a lot where pastors are just they come across one way, but really it's really to deflect what they're feeling on the inside. Have you seen that yourself?
Yeah, I would say that is true. And until you learn, it's like anything else in a small town. I mean, we had a new restaurant open up. It was a food truck in our town. And our town, to give you a bit of a demographic, we have 6 restaurants, and I use quotes on that because they're all bars, and they all have different. We have 6 bars and 6 churches. That's just how it goes. But and they're nice places to eat. And I know a lot of their owners. They're good people. But we had a barbecue food truck open up. It's just one dude, and he just sets up, in an empty lot and sells barbecue food. Mm-hmm. Like there was a kickback from our community because everybody for half a second says something new's on the block. I feel threatened. Business owners. And I think that we'd like to believe that because we have the Lord that, maybe pastors don't do that, but I still think
they do, man.
Things shake up. You just feel it. You go, man, is this going to be an excuse for every disgruntled church member of mine to leave? Is this going to be, what are they trying to do here? Do they care about the town like I do? What's the effect? And it's just, and it's fine. It's what it is, but it's hard to overcome, and so, but I think I loved what you said too about like general metrics. Cause if we're being honest, this conversation about like how we're reacting in rural settings and like, like how pastors are existing in rural settings. I think a lot of it comes down to the metrics we use, like to measure ministry, you know, because truth be told, like even beyond just comparing ourselves with other people, like we would almost actually be in good shape if all we had to compare ourselves to was just the pastors also in our small town. You know, if we only had a pool of 5 pastors to compare, or 2 pastors to compare ourselves to, man, that would be awesome, you know. But a lot of what I've seen from people is that I don't think and maybe, you know, you can see if this is something you also identify with, but I just don't know that our current church culture in America is set up to help rural pastors see themselves as successful. You know, maybe that's something you've seen as well.
I think it's in all settings. But honestly, I have said this so many times. I know our podcast listeners are tired of me saying it, but I really believe we're in the midst of a reformation and how we do church, how we carry out church in America is shifting. I think it's on this side of the pandemic. I think the pandemic highlighted some things in all churches that really weren't working before the pandemic, but people were just kind of used to going through the motions and doing what they do and showing up. And then they learned during the pandemic, hey, you know, I hadn't been to church in a year and my life's no different. Now, we all know that's not true spiritually, but what I'm saying is for so long,
that's their perception.
We're in what I believe today, we live in the residue of the seeker and attractional movements. So it was just like, come see us do our thing. Well, never was the God's plan. And honestly, in the rural setting, it's probably not as big a deal as it has been in other settings. But with all that said, I think there's a definite reformation that's taken place. To where, you know, we've got to analyze how we do this. And I did want to ask you this question. In the rural setting, let's say you're in a town that has 10 churches. Do those churches tend to work together, or do they tend to be isolated from each other? And when I mean specifically is because there's going to be different denominations. In an urban setting, most of the time, the denominations kind of stick with their own group. And again, I know there are ministerial groups everywhere.
Oh, sure.
But as a general rule, everybody kind of hangs out with their own kind. In a rural setting, you can't do that. Do you find that pastors from different denominations are more willing to come to the table and hang out? Or what have you seen in your experience?
You know, I do think that maybe there's been a bit of both, you know, and I think that just represents maybe some of the fragility of what we do at times. But in one sense, there is camaraderie simply because churches can't do it all. Like no single church is big enough to have every ministry that a family would require firing on all cylinders.
Yep.
Like I would argue that because of our youth center, you know, we have this kind of downtown property, and I say downtown loosely, the whole town's 16 blocks, but you know, downtown.
I'm seeing Bozeman when you said that, so
the whole town's 16 blocks, you know, and by 8 blocks, you know, is my small town. But in the middle of it, we have this property, and it was an old 7-Eleven gas station that the church bought and converted to a youth center. And so we've been able, again, like I said, not to do just religious good, but to do general good, to be something that's open, a positive atmosphere. And we've seen probably 75% of our student body in Baker walk through our doors, and half of them have heard the gospel through our ministry. And then, of course, a fewer amount then still stick with it. But I would argue that no other church that I've seen has anything like that for youth. And so I have found myself pastoring students whose parents identify with the Assemblies of God denomination or more Pentecostal. I've found myself pastoring Baptist, you know, non-denom, Lutheran even. You know, I've found myself finding these different streams of religious thought all in our youth program because, again, a lot of churches say, well, we could try and do something, I suppose, but there is a church down the street who's doing youth and doing it pretty well, you know. And I would argue that we've got good kids programs, but there are other people who, you know, for a long time had done an even more solid job. And so I remember days where the conversation was, oh yeah, that's the kids ministry church, and that's the youth ministry church, and that's still the Catholic church over there, you know. But you know, there's just people doing different things, and so I would say yes. But on the flip side, and this maybe represents just the fragility of ministry, and maybe post-COVID is like, I think we are just living in times where, like I've done some research also into, like, part of my master's thesis was on ministering to LGBTQ youth and trying to walk through, you know, because I had students in my small town who said, hey, I identify this way because of internet culture. It just pervades everywhere, and there's conversations everywhere and people everywhere. And they said, hey, this is one of my struggles. And I said, well, I feel woefully unequipped to deal with that conversation. So I went and got a master's degree and read a ton of books and articles and interviews, and have just really tried to make that part of how I communicate and
Sure.
what I talk through. But the hard part is that right now, obviously, one of the major demarcating lines for churches in America is becoming, are you pro LGBTQ or are you not pro LGBTQ? And of course, you've got people on both sides of the aisle who claim they're living God's truth and all these things. And we find ourselves, just to clarify, coming from that more traditional stance of not being pro LGBTQ. But one of the weirdest things is I still, though, did this master's degree, and I still learned a lot of compassionate language. Like, I'm not necessarily theologically on board, but I'm also much more compassionate towards the people group than I ever have been.
Yep.
And one of the side effects of our small town is that as I was trying to have these conversations, by just having the conversation, I found myself labeled and mislabeled as someone who had gone off the deep end, who had thrown away biblical authority. And it caused a ripple effect through our community. And so we have one time a year at our county fair where we do this thing called Cowboy Church. It's just very Midwest rural. Yep. But and the goal was that all these different groups of individuals, all these churches would get together and have one combined service at our fairgrounds Sunday morning. It was community driven. We switched pastors every year, all these things. And it was great. Well, the last couple of years, we had 4 churches back out, and they cited doctrinal differences. And I've had conversations with some of them since then. And it turns out one of them was really hardcore and just said, hey, even by hosting the conversation, entertaining the thought, which my goal was always just to give voice to a group of people that's hurting, not to slide my theology, but to say, let's add some compassion to the truth that we carry. But even by doing that, you get mislabeled and misheard and misunderstood, and you're trying to figure it out yourself. So there's days you do well and days you don't. And it caused this huge breakdown in the community that I don't even think we've really fully recovered from, but that story is being repeated everywhere. It's not just my 6 churches. It's everywhere where these conversations are at the forefront, and people are starting to look at each other with a side eye saying, well, where are you landing though? And where are you at? It's huge.
Yeah, I know. Heard a story of a pastor who, during the height of the racial issues that were going on, preached a message about racial reconciliation, and actually 3 pastors who were actually fired at their churches that afternoon for just approaching the subject, and so those are unique things, and they're so difficult. There's so many more things I want to dive into. We need to take a quick break. We're gonna take a quick break. When we come right back, I want to ask you some specific things about what you guys are, offering as a ministry. So take a quick break. Be right back. Back with Joe here, and just having a great conversation. And as we just before we went to break, just got to the real heart of the issue. In the church world, boy, we are often more described by what we're against than what we're for. And so I want to shift, Joe, to kind of talk about some specific things that I know you guys at your ministry are for. Kind of lay out what you prioritize as, the most, if you have one focus in rural advancement, what would it be? And then maybe some other issues or areas that you guys focus on.
Well, I think the main thing is just, I guess it's just shifting the whole understanding. I think that obviously for a long time, rural has been viewed as a backwater context, just in a lot of ways, just in a ton of ways. Small town has just been looked at as undesirable, or even just as a feeder for a larger model. I know a ton of people who are advocating the multi-site model, where they say, well, let's take a healthy large church and let's go help, the struggling small towns. And I'm not against that. Obviously, there are a lot of small towns that are struggling. But one of the things that we're really for is not necessarily even disdaining a mega church for doing what it does. Like, we don't want to be against, the work of God in urban
all
places.
churches right now.
But we want to take a second and highlight the things that, like we want to give voice, whether it's podcasts, interviews, people get their master's degree in a rural setting, because it's really tied, kind of to that program, but just championing rural voices of saying, hey, not only does the rural church have like these lessons to teach the greater church, but the rural church in a lot of ways can be innovative. It can be, something that's on the cutting edge. It can be something that informs greater church culture. Again, oftentimes people say, well, the trends travel in from the coasts, and then they make their way all through the rural Midwest and all these rural contexts, and that's fine. But I think there's things that are coming out of the rural context, trends, new theological emphases, just kind of these different things that are being rediscovered, revalued. And that's really our goal, is to platform those voices so that, the church does not lose, the big church doesn't lose the rural voice, because again, God's Spirit is at work, and there's good things happening, and there's good trends emerging from the rural context.
Give us a couple of examples of what you would see or hold up as good trends or some good wins that you're hearing about.
Well, one of the things that I think is good is, and I'll start with what we talked about last week. So we talk about bivocational ministry, right? Or co-vocational, or whatever word you want to use. But the idea, of course, just, I doubt our listeners are unfamiliar, but just the idea that a pastor is going to be leading a church or working in a church in some fashion, but also working a different job. And so whether that means a pastor is a lead pastor who's also a chaplain and does another form of ministry for their co-vocation, or maybe they're just working a secular job. Like I know pastors who work at a hardware store, or they might find themselves in another, kind of emotionally fulfilling, like another side, kind of an adjacent ministry. So let's say a pastor is also working in the local school, and those two things can feed each other, or they're a coach or whatever, And so I think that a lot of people, because they're realizing there's such a shortage of pastors, are now maybe looking at the idea of bivocational ministry as, oh, wow, this is suddenly on the table. And meanwhile, you've got a rural church who has been doing it for a long time and not just doing it, but seeing the value in it. I had somebody on the podcast who argued with me, not argued, sorry, but we were discussing together. We were on the same side of this issue, but they mentioned that when we look at the future of the church, there's a real strong possibility that we're not just looking at isolated cases of bivocational pastors, but we're looking at a majority of bivocational pastors.
We've been saying that at 95 Network for a while now, that we believe in the next 10 years that there'll be more pastors who are bivocational than full-time, and not knocking full-time.
Right.
But I will say this, there, at least in my experience, there have been a lot, it's almost like there's been almost a stigma if you're bivocational, that you're not quote unquote good enough, or your church isn't good enough.
And there's an end goal, right? Being full-time is the end goal.
Yeah. And we think all that's shifting, and we talk about that a lot. One of our great team members, John Sanders, actually has developed a new ministry called Entree Pastors, and he and Les Hughes are helping pastors learn how to, what if you could pay your bills? What if you didn't have a financial strain? What if you had the chance to meet lost people weekly and get out?
Right.
And we all see that as a positive thing. And in fact, in our new Soul Care Essentials conference that we've been doing, our third session is built around the professional life, and we spend a lot of time talking about the value of being bivocational. And with the baby boomers they're dying. It's just as we record this, the youngest baby boomer is 57, and as that generation leaves, and they were our source of income, they were our source of attendance, and they were our source of volunteers. The next generation is coming up behind them.
And they have different patterns of giving, and they have different patterons of life, and what it means to serve and volunteer and commit and all those things.
And honestly, to be bivocational is really strong now.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. And I think too, one of the things we've noticed is and this is not just, rural, but it's societal, is if I said, the church has value exclusively as a religious organization, an unchurched person more and more is not agreeing with that. They say, unless your church does something else that affects my life, not only do I not care, but I actively don't want you here.
Yep.
I'm not saying everybody in society is like that, but a lot of the research in Barna, there's definitely a wave coming, right?
Yes.
And so my thing is if the church is losing value, well, then what churches are going to make it through that culling, through that pressure, through that season? It's going to be the churches who are adding value to their communities in other ways. And often a bivocational pastor can lead the way in that conversation.
So good. That's
one
worth
theological
conversation.
Yeah. And one of these, I was recently having a discussion with somebody, and one of the principles that I had never really thought of in these terms, but I think applies in this context is, and I never said it this way, right? All of us, hopefully as ministers, we've read the Gospels. I would think that would be a minimum, right? But I never realized that, I never put it this way. In the Gospels, you see Jesus doing three things. He does good to all, he reaches many, and he disciples few. And that's just his model. And for as many people as we can count, you take the guy who was blind and Jesus heals him, and it says he followed Jesus on the road. There are plenty of people that Jesus just did good to, and they left. And the thing was, we don't even have a record that he really tried to preach to all of them. Sometimes they just walked up and said, "Hey, can I get healed?" And he said, "Sure." And he did good for its own sake. A lot of the whole bringing the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven, and I'm not saying Jesus didn't have his goal as but even said like no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. So Jesus spends his time on earth doing good to all, and then seeing many reached. But ultimately, through the process of discipleship, he disciples few, and that becomes the pattern the church follows throughout history when it's really at its best. And again, let's look at a rural church. I'll take my own context, not to toot our own horn, but because it's easy for me to stratify this.
Sure.
Our church runs this youth center, right, that I mentioned. And then a couple of years ago, my pastor said, "Hey, we should open a coffee shop, make a community space for people." And so this coffee shop, the only standalone coffee shop, actually came up for sale. A lot of great faith circumstances happened. We got to see God's blessing, and we got to open this coffee shop. So now our church, runs the only independent coffee shop in town as a fully functioning, business arm. And then we got this youth center. So we're making these community outposts. And I would argue that those settings are about doing good to everybody. I had a business owner. So we opened our coffee shop May 5th. Or no. It was March 5th of 2020. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Good time.
So
good
like right in the middle, and the governor of Montana had just started to allow, or maybe it was April 5th. Sorry, it was April, because we'd done work throughout March, because March really it flared up, and there was the first shutdown and whatever.
Yeah.
But we opened up and we had to have all the distance measures in place, and everyone was supposed to wear masks and all these things. But we had a business owner approach us, a friend of mine, and he said, "Thank you. Thank your church for bringing life to our main street."
Wow.
And that wasn't an example of no one directly got saved in that moment, but by being bivocational, by saying that we could wear the hat of pastor and barista, because I do still, I still wear both those hats. We were able to interject and do good. And the thing is, over the last 2.5 years, we have had families get saved, attend our church, or families come visit our church, or other churches use our space to grow their own ministries and Bibles, all these things. And again, I think bivocational, the important aspect of it is that we are adding value beyond what is just religious, but ultimately it is all tied together. As much as I would say we're doing that, it's well, no, because one will flow into the other, which will flow into discipleship, which will flow into the growth of the kingdom of God. And the sooner we can embrace that model, I really think the wave of the future is going to be something we can ride instead of get drowned by. So
the shift is taking place from, from come and see to go and tell, which we were originally told to go and tell. and a wonderful way to go and tell is doing what you just said. And I was just, again, thinking about where my daughter lives in Bozeman. We'd love to go up and down downtown street, the main street there. It's just cool. It's like this Western thing. And we just happened to stumble across a church while we were there who had just purchased the old movie theater. And they're doing exactly what you're talking about. And they're providing ministry during the week. And there's opportunities there to connect with the community. So there is a major shift that's taking place. And there is a shift toward bivocational. And for me, again, I've been in ministry for 40 years. This feels like the first time that bivocational has almost been championed versus almost looks
desirable
like
versus
less
just
than
undesirable,
kind of thing.
right?
Yeah,
you'll do it if you have to. But we're really seeing, I did a 6-part series on the Rural Advancement Podcast that was all about bivocational voices. And you found everybody on there. You found the people who did it because they had to, did it because they wanted to, did it full-time, did it part-time, whatever, But ultimately, the wisdom that came from that group of 6 pastors was just indispensable. They're really killing it,
Yeah. And so there's another great opportunities there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so just in when you're talking about, hey, what else have we really wanted to see at Rural Advancement? What are we championing? One of the things that I've loved is we've been able to discuss with pastors kind of the general pastoral shift, right? So there's a theological idea that I really love in regards to the nature of pastoring. And a lot of it comes actually out of Eugene Peterson's book, The Pastor, right? It was a memoir. I don't know if you're familiar with Eugene Peterson, right? But
I love the message.
Right. Yeah. The Message translation is what he's
Mhm.
known for, and obviously he breathed some poetic life into a Bible translation that we enjoy. But a lot of his written works are incredibly powerful. Like his books are, like I would argue that, like as far as discipleship resources, as far as for a pastor, like I cannot recommend him more. So one of the things, he wrote this memoir called The Pastor in 2011, I believe, before he passed away.
Mhm.
And in it, he talks about rediscovering the lost art of pastoring, because in his viewpoint, pastoring is a lot about living and dying with people. It's about being present and helping spiritually process the normal rhythms of life.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I've noticed is, in a culture that has up to this point, like you said, really, we've been in the age of the attractional model. So you usually have at the top of that list, you have brilliant communicators,
Mhm.
you have hugely efficient churches administratively, you have large reach, you have this urban focus, this, and of course we've even seen really in the last 5 years the fallout from some of those mega church models.
Yeah.
You've got the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and you've got the Hillsong documentaries, and you've got these high profile moral failures, and all these things, and people are now questioning, how does accountability work, how does that structure work, whatever. But anyways, he made the case in his book. He said a lot of times when a church grows, so let's say a church is 50 people, grows to 100, goes to 150, keeps on trucking, right?
Mhm.
A lot of the same skills that make a pastor get outsourced, right? And again, it's part of the necessity of it. Like a pastor of a church of 1,500 cannot make every hospital visit, can't do every funeral, can't do every wedding.
Yep.
But in one sense, he argues, he says a lot of the skills become CEO, administrative, leadership development. It's a lot of, and communication from the pulpit. A lot of those things become maybe more in the forefront. But one of the things we're rediscovering, obviously post-pandemic, and it's something that the rural church is, I would argue, more naturally ready for, because it never really left, is this idea of pastoring as, like, first and foremost and almost exclusively about authenticity and about helping people process and about being present for the mundane, ordinary aspects of life. I had a recent interesting conversation. We were at a pastor's conference for the Assemblies of God in Butte, Montana. And while we were there, as a spiritual enriching exercise, we actually were given the opportunity to go visit a Serbian Orthodox church. Okay. And so the Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, any Orthodox church, right, is pretty outside of our Protestant thought process, right?
Yes,
like it's
absolutely.
It's just not what a lot of us, any of us, Methodists, any denomination, it doesn't matter. We're all kind of on the outside of that. And we were listening to this Orthodox priest passionately walk through, why he values orthodoxy and the iconography and really the tradition of it all. And because it's a very old thought process, it's a very Eastern thought process.
Mhm.
And he mentioned he said to me, he said, honestly, he said, Orthodox denominations are growing as quick, if not quicker, than a lot of Western denominations today. And when he said that, first I was like, I want to see some sources. But my second thought was, man, wait a second. What do you mean it's growing? He's like, yep, like 10% a year. We've reflected growth, and all these things. And he starts chatting through these statistics and all these things. And I'm like, there's no way. Like, what? But he said, but because again, it's so foreign to me, not a knock on the Orthodox Church. It just was so foreign to me because I'm like, man, that is something I would view as shrinking or decreasing or even just holding steady. But to say it's growing. And so he made the case. He said, honestly, what people are finding is that the system by which we measured, again, church success, the church that we've offered to people, has been disconnected in a sense from authentic, participatory, experiential, like worship. And so while I was surprised by what he said, after a while, I really wasn't surprised because, again, a lot of what we consider pastoring is building a church, growing it as much as we can, seeing where that takes us, developing all these leaders, and nothing's wrong with that. But a lot of people are flocking to a church that can connect with its roots, that models maybe some of that ministry of presence, where a sanctuary, because again, large church pastors are frequently pressured to make statements, right? No one's asking me how I feel politically. I'm in a town of 1,200, and to be quite honest, it's pretty Republican up here. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's one clear political party.
I know where you are.
But large church pastors are being challenged to get up and speak politically, and somehow, sadly, they're just because of those pressures, pastors are viewed as divisive, and a sanctuary. The idea of a sanctuary, of somewhere where you can escape the problems of this world and find peace is a lot of why the Orthodox Church matters. Their service is 2 hours long, and it's predominantly worship, it's experiential, and it's peaceful, it's tranquil. And so I really think when we watch pastors engage in ministry in the future, one of the things we want to champion in rural advancement is that a lot of the gifts put in the rural church are the wave of the future. So when a pastor is present, when he's in the same family, when he is doing a child dedication or baptism, or whatever you feel about that, or doing the baptism for the family members, or being present when the son leaves and comes back from college, and when he's performing the weddings of those people, and when he's helping them process grief. A lot of the things that are just normal day-to-day mundane things are a lot of what I believe people are going to be looking for in a pastor going forward. And so that's maybe some of the lessons that have drawn out, but also, again, some of the messages we're trying to continue to champion is not just is rural existing, but it has something to say. And not only does it have something to say, but what it has to say could in fact carry the seeds of the future of the church. And so, that's a little dramatic, but it's something I'm passionate about.
It's not that dramatic. I mean, I'm because of 95 Network's reach, we get to work with so many different denominations, and I'm not very familiar with the Anglican Church, but it's making a huge comeback. Specifically, it's making a huge comeback in the United States for a lot of the same reasons that you just described, where people are looking for authenticity, and then you marry that with the next generations that are coming up. That's what they're looking for. So as I said earlier, the model of how we do church, and again, that's how we carry out what we do, has been off the rails for a while, and it takes me back. The whole time you're talking, I just keep hearing Jesus. He founded the church, and then he, through his friend Paul, tells us, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you these gifts: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, to equip saints to do ministry. And that in a nutshell is what our calling is to do, is to use the gift that's within us, that pastoral gift, to raise up people, to disciple people, to love people, and I do believe this. I believe, is people may wonder, is there a certain number that shows health? No, health is all relative to your context and where you are. Sure. But I will say this: I think as long as there's lost people in your community, you're not done yet. As long as there's opportunities to share Christ with people, but you're going to have to become innovative. You're going to have to take advantage of opportunities like you guys have done with the coffee shop. There's just opportunities there, one, to help pay the bills, but also
because honestly, we've supported our staff and our pastors. I had to. So our church is unique in that we actually have several paid staff. We've got a lead pastor who's paid through church tithing, like a normal model would. But our youth pastor, which was my job for 9 years, and we recently hired a younger associate. But the youth pastor position was funded half through giving from the church. But then we sold fireworks every summer and did a fair booth where we sell Indian tacos. And not only are these community touch points, and so we're doing this community ministry, but financially it made it viable.
Those firework things make a lot of money.
So then, by managing a full-time business, the coffee shop, we were actually able to bring in a third pastor whose salary draws entirely from the coffee shop. Then when we did hire this younger associate, the church had a house, so I got to. That's part of my pay package, is to have this house and bills paid, which is a huge blessing. And also my wife, works, which is really great. She's a champ, but she works in economic development and has a real job, so I would be like playing video games with teenagers on the weekend. And I'm like, this is my job. And she's like, okay, well, I'm out here getting money for a hospital. It was funny. But when we hired another youth pastor, I basically made the choice to kind of acknowledge I was going bivocational in a sense. I gave up my fully given church salary to be able to hire this younger associate. But because we had a coffee shop, well, now 30 hours a week baristering for an hourly wage is now part of how I support myself. But all of everything I just mentioned is innovative in a sense. Not like I'm saying we cracked the code.
It's completely.
But when people say, well, how do you have this many full-time staff? I'm like, because we just, we stretched here and we pinched there and we moved this over here and we tried to set this up. It just, all of it took creativity. And that's what I hope a lot of pastors take away is when we dive into the rural church, when those resources, the boomers are unfortunately, dying off, and a lot of the support structures of the church are changing, more and more, the rural church is going to have to do what it's always done, is to be innovative, to be resourceful, to do more with less, and to see how that can happen. And I just think that a lot of things we've discussed today about changing the nature of what it means to pastor, kind of rediscovering that, or being community engaged and being bivocational. A lot of these have the seeds of the solution.
We could talk for hours.
We could.
You're a great resource, and so I will have all the connecting points of how to get in touch with you in the show notes. But one of the things I want to do as we wrap up the podcast is I always like to ask this question, and I'd love to ask you, and Joe, if you're sitting down today with an individual, with a pastor, and you're having a coffee together, what is a word of encouragement or wisdom or advice or a hope you would share with the pastor today in the midst of this particular environment that we live in today?
So I've actually surprisingly been asked this question before, and my answer, has been developed and hasn't changed. So I'm a huge fan of church history. It's just a personal intellectual bent of mine, and I love studying how the gospel has moved and grown. And I remember at the height of the pandemic, or what we called the height at the time, I went to a board meeting, and I love our board members, but it was a pretty pessimistic meeting. People were saying, man, if we shut down, and are we ever going to open again? And how does this all work out? And I remember saying, I said, the church is like a dandelion. It's like a weed. Like, no matter how hard you try, like, the church of God throughout history has survived in every context. Governments that loved it, governments that hated it, countries that were antithetical to the gospel. It has survived. And so the encouragement I give pastors is like, yes, I cannot promise that our jobs will look the same or that our roles will look the same, but the church will go on. And sometimes I think that as pastors, we just need to maybe sit back, because again, we're all a little bit control freaks. No matter what, we lead the church. We're all a little bit, we grab onto things and say, well, I want to make sure I'm heading this thing right, But if we just sit back and say, God, maybe I can just be part of the river of where this is going. Maybe I can flow with the story of God in history a little bit. Just keep my eyes open, keep my heart open, see what comes down the pipeline. And as church shifts, we'll find ourselves on the other side, just like the church has done 100 times, is finding ourselves flourishing in a new context. Because again, it reminds me a lot of that story in Acts where he says, if God is in it, you will find yourself not fighting against these men, but against God. And I just encourage you with that. It's like, church has been around, it'll stay around, and whatever it looks like in the next 20 years, we have the ability through just staying close with God to be connected to it and to see it grow. And so that's my thoughts.
Joe, that's so good. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us. And again, I'm going to put the connecting points in the show notes with you, but I love what you guys are doing and I appreciate your heart. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me on here. It's it always fires me up to have these kind of conversations. So
thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.